The smell was unmistakable, sweet, warm, and utterly foreign. On October 12, 1945, Fumiko Nakamura stood frozen at the edge of the forest near Yokohama, her thin fingers gripping her 7-year-old son Hiroshi's bony shoulder. The strange, enticing aroma had drawn them nearly 2 kilometers from their bombed-out neighborhood. What Fumiko witnessed in the clearing ahead defied 40 years of careful cultural conditioning and 3 years of intense wartime propaganda. American soldiers, the same devils her government had warned would torture and kill Japanese civilians, were cooking pancakes on massive griddles and serving them to a gathering of local children. The youngsters sat on makeshift benches, their hollow cheeks now rounded with food, laughing as U.S. Army cooks in white aprons demonstrated how to pour maple syrup. Hiroshi tugged at his mother's ragged sleeve, his eyes wide with hunger and confusion. What Fumiko saw defied 14 years of imperial education and countless government broadcasts about American barbarism. In that moment, standing at the forest's edge, while the scent of pancakes drifted on the autumn breeze, her understanding of defeat took on an entirely new dimension. The Japanese Empire had constructed an elaborate mythology about their American enemies. Throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, official government propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, and morally corrupt, yet simultaneously as savage demons who would commit unspeakable atrocities if they ever reached Japanese shores. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese civilians received increasingly dire warnings. Imperial broadcasts described American soldiers as beasts in human form who would rape women, bayonet children, and torture captives for amusement. Official newspapers printed detailed accounts of alleged American war crimes, while government-issued pamphlets instructed civilians on hiding techniques and, in some cases, methods of suicide to avoid capture. The reality of occupation would prove dramatically different. When American forces arrived in Japan following Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, they brought with them not torture implements, but unprecedented amounts of food, medicine, and supplies. The Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, had prepared for the occupation with characteristic thoroughness. American supply ships delivered tons of foodstuffs to feed not only occupation personnel, but also the starving Japanese civilian population. The contrast between expectation and reality could hardly have been more stark. By autumn 1945, Japan stood on the brink of mass starvation. 6 years of war had devastated the nation's agriculture and fishing industries. Allied bombing had destroyed 70% of urban areas, leaving millions homeless. Food rations had dwindled to less than 1,000 calories per day for most civilians, with rice often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to extend supplies. Government surveys conducted immediately after surrender revealed that 63% of Japanese children exhibited signs of malnutrition. The average adult had lost between 15 and 20% of their pre-war body weight. In Tokyo alone, an estimated 64,000 people suffered from beriberi and other nutrient deficiency diseases. Against this backdrop of deprivation, American military kitchens represented an almost incomprehensible abundance. A typical U.S. Army field kitchen in occupied Japan served approximately 3,500 meals per day, with each American serviceman allocated nearly 4,000 calories daily. This meant that even accounting for wastage, a single American military mess unit might discard more food in one day than a Japanese family of 4 would receive in rations for an entire month. Colonel William Henderson of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps noted in his October 1945 report, "The contrast between our supply situation and local conditions cannot be overstated. Our enlisted men routinely discard more food than most Japanese civilians can access in a week. This creates both operational challenges and potential opportunities for humanitarian engagement." Lieutenant James Mackenzie, serving with the 8th Army's occupation forces in Yokohama, recorded his impressions in letters home. "The people here are literally starving before our eyes. Children follow our garbage trucks. I've started instructing my men to separate edible leftovers from true waste. It seems obscene to throw away food when skeletal children watch from just beyond our compound fence. This was the world Fumiko Nakamura navigated as she stood at the forest's edge that October morning, watching American soldiers serve breakfast to Japanese children, including many who had lost parents in the very bombing campaigns these same Americans had executed months earlier. The journey that brought Fumiko and Hiroshi to that forest clearing began 3 days earlier, when rumors spread through their temporary shelter about American soldiers distributing food in neighboring districts. Like most Japanese civilians in the immediate post-surrender period, Fumiko initially dismissed such stories as dangerous fantasies. Her husband, a mid-level civil servant, had been killed during the firebombing of Tokyo in May 1945. Since then, she had focused solely on keeping herself and Hiroshi alive, trading her few remaining possessions for rice and sweet potatoes on the black market. We were told the Americans would poison any food they offered, Fumiko later recalled in an interview for the Occupation History Project in 1962. Officials warned us that accepting enemy food was both treasonous and suicidal. But by October, hunger had become a more immediate threat than any American soldier. Desperation drove countless Japanese civilians to similar reckonings during those early occupation days. 19-year-old Keiko Tanaka, who had served in a munitions factory until Japan's surrender, described her first encounter with American food distribution in her diary. "Today I saw impossible things. American soldiers giving chocolate to children, enormous sacks of rice being unloaded from trucks with red crosses painted on their sides, an officer speaking through an interpreter, saying more would come tomorrow. Part of me still expects this is an elaborate trick before they reveal their true intentions. But another part, the hungry part, doesn't care anymore." For many Japanese civilians, these initial food encounters represented their first direct contact with Americans, creating cognitive dissonance that no propaganda could have prepared them for. Masahiro Ito, a former school teacher in Osaka, wrote in his memoirs, "We had been taught that Americans were barbaric individualists without proper culture or respect for hierarchy. Yet here they were, organizing orderly food distributions with remarkable efficiency. Their soldiers stood at attention when officers passed. They followed complex logistical procedures. Everything contradicted what we had been told." The first major organized American food relief effort began on September 3, 1945, when the military government established 26 distribution centers in Tokyo alone. Within 2 weeks, similar operations existed in every major Japanese city under occupation control. By early October, American quartermaster records indicate that occupation forces were distributing approximately 2,000 metric tons of food daily to Japanese civilians, predominantly rice, flour, powdered milk, and canned goods. Captain Robert Wallace, who supervised food distribution in northern Tokyo, noted in his official report, initial attendance at distribution points was primarily orphaned children and elderly citizens too desperate to maintain suspicion. Working-age adults, particularly men, remained skeptical and distant. By week 3, however, the composition of recipients reflected general population demographics, suggesting that practical needs were overcoming indoctrinated fears. The field kitchen that Fumiko discovered near Yokohama represented a different, less formal approach to addressing civilian hunger. Established by the 353rd Infantry Regiment, this operation began when mess sergeants noticed local children watching them discard leftover breakfast foods. Rather than simply allowing children to scavenge from garbage, several non-commissioned officers obtained permission to establish a morning meal program using surplus supplies. Staff Sergeant Henry Wilson, who helped initiate the program, explained in a letter to his wife in Iowa, "It started with just 5 or 6 kids hanging around the garbage cans. Skinniest things you ever saw. None of us could stomach watching them fight over our scraps. So we talked to the captain, and he cleared it with the regiment. Now we serve about 70 kids breakfast every morning, mostly pancakes since we have surplus flour, and powdered eggs. The kids were suspicious at first, but hunger is a powerful motivator. Now they bring their friends. The pancake breakfast served by the 353rd became something of a local phenomenon. By mid-October, between 70 and 100 Japanese children received breakfast there daily. Word spread through devastated neighborhoods, traveling first through children's networks, then gradually reaching adults desperate enough to overcome their conditioned fears. Hiroshi Nakamura, just 7 years old in 1945, retained vivid memories of that first pancake breakfast 6 decades later. The smell was like nothing I had ever experienced, sweet and rich. When Mother finally allowed us to approach the Americans, a tall soldier with red hair lifted me onto a bench. He showed me how to pour this brown liquid, maple syrup, over the flat cakes. I remember the stickiness on my fingers and the overwhelming sweetness. I had never tasted sugar in such quantity. I ate until my stomach hurt, then wrapped 2 pancakes in my handkerchief to bring back for my cousin. For Fumiko, watching her son eat his fill represented a profound rupture with everything authorities had prepared her to expect from defeat. In that moment, I understood that everything we had been told about Americans might be false, she later recounted. If they would feed our children before their own soldiers had eaten, perhaps other warnings were equally untrue. It was both relieving and terrifying to consider. The 353rd's pancake breakfast operation was far from unique. Throughout occupied Japan, individual American units established similar informal feeding programs. Military records indicate that by December 1945, more than 200 such initiatives existed across the country, serving approximately 45,000 meals daily to Japanese civilians, primarily children, pregnant women, and the elderly. Major General William Marquardt, who served as economic advisor to General MacArthur, observed in a memorandum dated November 23, 1945, these spontaneous feeding programs, while minuscule compared to official relief efforts, serve a critical diplomatic function. They create personal connections between occupation personnel and local populations that no formal policy could achieve. Each child who receives food directly from an American soldier represents a family whose perspective on occupation is being fundamentally reshaped. The pancake breakfasts and similar programs revealed a stark numerical reality that many Japanese civilians found difficult to comprehend. The daily caloric output of even a modest American field kitchen exceeded what many Japanese families had consumed in weeks. A standard U.S. Army field range could cook for approximately 200 personnel per meal. Each American serviceman's daily ration allocation included 8 ounces of meat, 12 ounces of vegetables, fresh fruit, coffee with sugar and cream, and portions of bread that alone contained more calories than many Japanese civilians received in their entire daily ration. The abundance extended beyond just quantity. Variety and quality of American military rations shocked Japanese observers accustomed to years of increasing deprivation. By 1945, the average Japanese civilian subsisted primarily on substitute foods: sweet potatoes instead of rice, tea made from roasted barley, soup from radish greens, and whatever proteins could be scavenged. Against this backdrop, American military meals featured multiple courses: fresh or canned fruits, dairy products, and desserts. Second Lieutenant David Cohen, serving with occupation forces in Kyoto, wrote to his parents in Chicago, "The people here can't believe what our guys eat. Yesterday our kitchen served roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie, and ice cream." An elderly Japanese man who had been hired to help with cleaning stood watching the food line with an expression I can only describe as religious awe. When the mess sergeant gave him leftovers to take home, he bowed so deeply I thought he might fall over. The material contrast extended beyond just food. American occupation forces brought with them an overwhelming abundance of everything Japan lacked after years of total war. Military vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and tanks consumed more gasoline daily than most Japanese cities had access to in a month. Each American soldier received new uniforms and boots regularly, while Japanese civilians wore patched and repatched clothing made from increasingly poor materials. Medical units arrived with antibiotics, vaccines, and other pharmaceuticals that had become unavailable to all but the highest Japanese military and government officials. Takeshi Yamamoto, who worked as a translator for occupation authorities in Tokyo, wrote in his journal, "The Americans use toilet paper as packaging material. They discard clothing rather than repair small tears. Their enlisted men wear better quality boots than our officers did. They brush their teeth with actual toothpaste, not salt or charcoal powder." Every day brings new examples of casual abundance that seems deliberately designed to demonstrate the futility of our resistance. For many Japanese civilians, the most shocking aspect of American abundance was its apparent limitlessness. Week after week, month after month, the flow of supplies continued unabated. In a nation conditioned by years of increasing scarcity, where civilians had been urged to tighten their belts for the war effort, and sacrifice had become a patriotic virtue, the seemingly inexhaustible American supply chain appeared almost supernatural. Colonial naval documents reveal that between September 1945 and March 1946, American ships delivered over 3 million tons of supplies to occupied Japan. This included not only military equipment and provisions for occupation forces, but increasingly humanitarian supplies designated specifically for civilian relief. A single Liberty ship might carry more food than an entire Japanese prefecture produced in a month. General MacArthur, recognizing both the humanitarian and strategic value of addressing civilian hunger, authorized Operation School Lunch in December 1945. This program provided a daily meal to Japanese schoolchildren using American surplus and specifically targeted shipments. By April 1946, approximately 7 million Japanese children received American-supplied school lunches daily. Each meal, while modest by American standards, typically contained between 600 and 800 calories, often more than children received from their families' rations. Dr. Tetsuo Hayashi, who served on Tokyo's Emergency Medical Board during the occupation, noted the program's rapid health impacts. Within 3 months of the school feeding program's implementation, we documented a 42% reduction in hospital admissions for malnutrition-related conditions among children aged 6 to 12. The American food quite literally saved an entire generation. The overwhelming evidence of American industrial and agricultural might force many Japanese to reconsider not just their understanding of their former enemy, but their entire worldview regarding Japan's place in the global order. Throughout the war, imperial propaganda had emphasized Japanese spiritual superiority over Western materialism. Officials acknowledged America's industrial capacity, but insisted that Japanese spiritual strength and willingness to sacrifice would prevail. The physical reality of American abundance in defeat demolished this narrative more effectively than any counter-propaganda could have. Satoshi Tanaka, a former Imperial Army officer who later became a historian of the occupation period, explained, for Japanese who had been told throughout the war that Americans were soft, decadent, and ultimately beatable despite their material advantages, the occupation presented irrefutable evidence of a miscalculation so profound it called everything into question. If authorities had been so wrong about American capabilities and intentions, what else might they have misrepresented? The contrast became increasingly difficult to ignore as occupation settled into routine. American military bases functioned as islands of plenty amid Japanese scarcity. Each base required extensive local labor, bringing thousands of Japanese workers into direct contact with American abundance. These workers observed firsthand the casual wastefulness that characterized American military operations, from barely used supplies being discarded to excess food being thrown away. Yoshiko Matsumoto, who worked as a laundress at an American base near Osaka, described her initial shock. They discarded shirts because of minor stains or loose buttons, items we would have carefully repaired and worn for years. Each day I brought home soap ends and thread spools that Americans considered garbage but were precious commodities for my family. My neighbors initially believed I was stealing until they found similar employment and witnessed the waste themselves. The psychological impact of this material contrast proved profound and multifaceted. For older Japanese who had lived through the militarization of society and embraced nationalistic propaganda, American abundance created cognitive dissonance that proved difficult to resolve. Many initially suspected a temporary show of wealth designed to impress and demoralize, a theory that became increasingly untenable as months passed with no reduction in American supplies. Hiroki Suzuki, a former government censor who later documented early occupation experiences, observed, "The elderly often proved most resistant to accepting American generosity, seeing it as somehow dishonorable or a trick. The young, however, particularly children receiving school lunches or attending events like the American pancake breakfasts, formed positive associations that would reshape Japan's relationship with America for generations." By spring 1946, medical examinations revealed measurable physical changes in the Japanese population directly attributable to American food relief. Children in areas with established school lunch programs gained an average of 3 to 4 kilograms. Rates of beriberi and other deficiency diseases declined sharply. Pregnant women receiving supplemental rations through occupation medical programs delivered healthier babies with significantly higher birth weights than those recorded during the final war years. The transformation extended beyond just physical health. Teachers reported improved academic performance and attendance rates among students receiving school meals. Labor productivity increased as workers gained strength. Even crime statistics reflected the impact, with theft of food items declining nearly 60% between October 1945 and June 1946 in areas with established relief programs. For Fumiko Nakamura and her son Hiroshi, the pancake breakfasts at the 353rd Field Kitchen became a regular part of life during those early occupation months. Initially attending just once weekly due to lingering suspicion, by December they visited nearly every morning. Hiroshi gained weight, his sunken cheeks filling out, his energy returning. More significantly, his attitude toward Americans underwent a fundamental shift that would influence his entire life trajectory. "The Americans at the Pancake Kitchen knew us by name," Hiroshi recalled decades later. "Sergeant Wilson would save extra syrup for me. A corporal named Davis taught me English words while I ate. They were not the monsters from our school books, but ordinary men with photographs of their own children back in America. By Christmas, I no longer felt fear when I saw American uniforms, only hoped that they might have chocolate or chewing gum in their pockets." Fumiko's transformation proved more complex but equally profound. In January 1946, she began working as a seamstress, repairing American uniforms, bringing home not only wages, but often small gifts of food and supplies from sympathetic soldiers. Her diary entries from this period reveal her evolving perspective. "Today I mended 17 shirts and was given a can of powdered milk and 2 chocolate bars for Hiroshi. The sergeant apologized that it wasn't more. Apologized for giving me treasure. I do not understand these Americans. If our situations were reversed, would we show such kindness to their children? I am ashamed to admit I do not believe we would." This sentiment, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and retrospective shame, appeared frequently in Japanese accounts from the early occupation period. Many adults who had fully embraced wartime propaganda struggled to reconcile their previous beliefs with the evidence before them. Some resolved this dissonance by compartmentalizing, viewing food distributing Americans as exceptions rather than representatives of their nation. Others underwent more complete ideological transformations. Masaru Ogawa, a former schoolteacher who later became prominent in Japan's Democratic Socialist Party, described his evolution. "I had instructed my students that Americans were barbaric individualists without proper cultural values. When I saw American soldiers establishing orderly feeding programs, standing in formation, and demonstrating remarkable organizational discipline, all while treating our defeated people with unexpected kindness, I recognized that I had participated in a massive deception. This recognition shaped my post-war political activities and commitment to educational reform. By spring 1946, American occupation authorities had largely transitioned from emergency feeding programs to more sustainable agricultural and economic rehabilitation efforts. The immediate crisis of starvation had been averted, though food shortages would persist for several more years. The pancake breakfasts and similar informal programs gradually became unnecessary as Japan's domestic food production recovered and commercial activity resumed. Yet the psychological impact of these early food encounters echoed for decades through Japanese society. Children who received American candy, pancakes, or school lunches grew up with fundamentally different attitudes toward the United States than previous generations had held. Many developed lifelong interests in American culture, language, and educational opportunities. Some, like Hiroshi Nakamura, would eventually emigrate to the United States, completing a journey that began with pancake breakfasts in 1945. Sociological studies conducted in the 1960s and 70s consistently found more positive attitudes toward Americans among Japanese who had been children during the occupation. Researcher Michiko Tanaka's landmark 1972 study, Occupation Experiences and Post-War Attitudes, documented this phenomenon. Respondents who reported receiving food directly from American personnel during the 1945 to 1947 period demonstrated significantly more favorable views toward U.S.-Japan relations, American cultural influences, and even American foreign policy than those without such experiences. Even when controlling for other factors, the impact extended into Japan's remarkable post-war economic development. Many Japanese business leaders and government officials who guided the nation's recovery had experienced American abundance firsthand during occupation. This exposure influenced not only their personal consumption habits, but their industrial and commercial ambitions. Japan's transition from a militaristic economy to a consumer-oriented one reflected lessons learned during those early occupation days. Economist Takeo Fujikawa, who served in MacArthur's economic advisory staff and later helped shape Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry policies, observed the occupation period provided Japanese planners with an immersive education in American production methods, supply chain management, and consumer capitalism. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity in 1945 became a powerful motivating force behind our economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s. We did not want to merely rebuild our pre-war economy. We wanted refrigerators, automobiles, and abundant food like we had witnessed Americans enjoying. For Fumiko Nakamura, the pancake breakfasts represented a turning point in her understanding of both defeat and recovery. In her final interview before her death in 1988, she reflected, "Those mornings watching Hiroshi eat American pancakes taught me something essential about human nature. Our government had spent years convincing us that Americans were demons who would destroy us if they won. Instead, they fed our children pancakes with maple syrup. This simple kindness, this abundance shared freely, did more to transform Japan than any military action could have. We had been fighting an enemy who could afford to waste more than we could produce, yet in victory, they chose generosity over punishment." This revelation shaped everything that followed. The 353rd Infantry Regiment's pancake breakfast continued through March 1946 before being rendered unnecessary by improving local conditions. By then, the program had served more than 15,000 meals to Japanese children. Similar initiatives throughout occupied Japan collectively provided millions of meals during those critical early occupation months, using surplus American supplies to address immediate humanitarian needs while formal relief programs developed. Staff Sergeant Henry Wilson, who helped establish the Pancake Kitchen near Yokohama, received a commendation for his efforts before returning to Iowa in June 1946. His personal photographs, donated to the Occupation History Museum in Tokyo in 1979, include several images of Japanese children at the field kitchen, including one of Hiroshi Nakamura sitting on an ammunition crate, smiling with syrup on his chin. Hiroshi Nakamura emigrated to the United States in 1967, eventually settling in Seattle, where he established a successful import-export business, facilitating trade between American and Japanese companies. When interviewed for an oral history project in 2005, he stated, "Everything in my life traces back to those pancake breakfasts. They showed me an America different from what I had been taught to fear, an America of abundance and generosity." Following that smell of pancakes through the forest. That October morning was the first step on a journey that ultimately brought me here, the story of Japanese civilians following the smell of pancakes to discover American field kitchens. Feeding their children encapsulates a larger historical truth about occupation and cultural transformation. In the immediate aftermath of history's most destructive war amid devastation and hunger, simple acts of shared abundance created human connections that transcended political and military enmity. What propaganda had failed to achieve through years of indoctrination, pancakes accomplished in moments, revealing the humanity of supposed enemies and the false premises upon which wartime hatreds had been constructed. The statistics tell one part of this story. 3 million tons of American supplies delivered within 6 months. 7 million Japanese children receiving school lunches by spring 1946. 42% reduction in malnutrition-related hospitalizations. 15,000 pancake breakfasts served by a single infantry regiment. But the human experiences tell another, perhaps more significant truth, that ideological certainties seldom survive direct contact with contradictory evidence, especially when that evidence arrives in the form of food freely given to hungry children. In the decades following occupation, as Japan rebuilt and eventually emerged as an economic powerhouse and American ally, the lessons of those early pancake breakfasts remained relevant. Nations that had devoted unprecedented resources to destroying one another discovered more productive forms of competition and cooperation. Children who once studied wartime propaganda grew up to forge international business partnerships, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic alliances. Fumiko Nakamura's journey from forest edge to pancake breakfast table represented a microcosm of Japan's larger post-war transformation, from fear to curiosity, from suspicion to cautious engagement, and ultimately from defeated enemy to steadfast ally. The maple syrup that sweetened Hiroshi's pancakes that October morning in 1945 symbolized something his mother could scarcely comprehend at the time. That defeat, when met with generosity rather than retribution, could become the foundation for renewal rather than the bitter end of a national story. Today, few remember the pancake breakfasts of early occupation. Most participants, both American servers and Japanese recipients, have passed away. The 353rd Infantry Regiment's field kitchen near Yokohama exists only in military records and fading photographs. Yet the consequences of those morning meals continue to shape international relations, cultural attitudes, and individual lives nearly 8 decades later, a testament to how moments of unexpected humanity amid historical conflict can echo through generations, rewriting the stories nations tell about themselves and their former enemies.